Hello students, teachers, parents, history nerds. Hello everybody, and welcome to Nutshelled History, where we lay out the facts, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Today, we are going to continue our economics series by looking at fiscal and monetary policy. Don't forget that there's a link for a fill-in-the-blank worksheet in the description. I just ask that you like and subscribe. I apologize for any mispronunciations ahead of time. I do my best. Okay, let's go. Fiscal policy is like the government's attempt at playing economic DJ, using taxes and spending to control the beat of the nation's economy. This all ties into the federal budget, which is basically a year-long shopping list that outlines how much the government plans to make and spend. The budget process kicks off with every federal agency throwing in their best guess at next year's expenses. Kind of like trying to budget your groceries, but with a lot more zeros. They send this to the Office of Management and Budget, OMB, which is like the president's financial BFF. The OMB reviews, tweaks, and hands the president a shiny new budget proposal, which then heads to Congress. There, the budget gets another makeover courtesy of the Congressional Budget Office, before Congress sends it back to the president for a signature. If the president doesn't like what he sees, cue the veto. Sort of like rejecting the toppings on a pizza until it's just right. Now there are two flavors of fiscal policy, expansionary and contractionary. Expansionary policy is the government's way of hitting the gas on economic growth, spending more and cutting taxes so people have extra cash to throw around. Contractionary policy is the brake pedal, slowing things down by cutting spending or hiking taxes, always a party killer. Of course, making fiscal policy isn't a walk in the park. Congress and the president can't change everything in the budget, and predicting the economy is like trying to guess the weather a year in advance. By the time a budget is approved and implemented, the economy might have already done its own thing. And let's not forget, nobody ever throws a parade for a tax increase. There are different theories about the use of fiscal policy to fix the economy. Classical economics is basically the chill out, the market's got this school of thought, believing that the economy is like a self-cleaning oven, it'll take care of itself. But then the Great Depression showed up like an uninvited guest that just wouldn't leave, and the whole it'll fix itself idea didn't quite hold up. Enter John Maynard Keynes, who looked around and said, hey, maybe the government should, do something. His theory, now known as Keynesian economics, suggested that the government should step in, start buying stuff, and get people working again. Since businesses weren't going to make products that broke, jobless people couldn't buy. Keynes's idea also came with a cool trick called the multiplier effect, which basically says that if the government spends $10 billion, the economy could get a much bigger boost than just $10 billion. It's like an economic ripple effect. Companies spend that money on wages and materials, and the people who get that money spend it too. It's fiscal policy with a side of chain reaction. Then came the supply-siders, who said, hold up, what if we just cut taxes and let people keep their money? The idea here was that people would take that extra cash and invest it in businesses, which would in theory create jobs and fuel the economy. In the years after World War II, Keynes was the guy everyone listened to. But in the 1980s, Reagan rolled in with supply-side economics and a fresh wave of tax cuts. Fast forward to the 2007 recession, and suddenly, Keynes was cool again, with the government stepping in to bail out the economy. So it's kind of like a tug of war between two friends with different ideas on how to throw a party. One wants to spend big to get it going, while the other thinks cutting the cover charge will bring in the crowd. All this stuff affects the budget, of course. A balanced budget is like that mythical unicorn everyone talks about but rarely sees. In theory, it's when the government's income equals its spending. But in reality, the federal budget is almost never balanced. When the government actually brings in more than it spends, it's called a surplus, a rare and magical event. But when it spends more than it collects, which is basically every year, we get a budget deficit. And that's the government's version of living paycheck to paycheck, except with way more zeros. To pay for these extra expenses, the government has two options: print money, hello inflation, or borrow it. Spoiler alert, they usually borrow. Uncle Sam does this by selling bonds, which are basically IOUs. When the government borrows money, it adds to the national debt, the grand total of everything we owe. And here's where it gets tricky. When people buy government bonds, they're not investing in businesses. So it's like the government's hogging all the cash. Plus, we have to pay interest on those bonds, which means less money for, useful stuff. Back in the 1980s, the government's budget was such a mess that Congress tried to pass laws to rein in spending, but the Supreme Court wasn't having it. Some folks even suggested we amend the Constitution to force a balanced budget, but critics worried that would tie the government's hands in a crisis. Just before the new millennium, we actually saw a few budget surpluses for the first time in decades. Cue the confetti. But then came war, tax cuts, and a recession, and the deficits came roaring back, proving once again that balancing the budget is like trying to ride a bike uphill in a hurricane. If only we can make money just like magically appear. Wait, can we? Money enters the economy through a process called money creation, which sounds way more magical than it really is. It's not like the Fed has a money-making machine in the basement cranking out bills Willy Wonka style. Instead, banks do the heavy lifting. Here's the trick. When you deposit $1,000 in your bank, the bank doesn't just keep it sitting around. They loan out most of it to someone else. That person eventually deposits it in their bank, which also loans out most of it, and the cycle keeps going. By the end, your $1,000 is like a social butterfly that somehow turned into hundreds more dollars just by bouncing around. Now, the Federal Reserve, the Fed, our economy's babysitter, has three main tricks up its sleeve to adjust the amount of money floating around. The first one is the reserve requirement, which is just a fancy way of telling banks how much of your deposit they have to keep on lockdown. Lower the reserve requirement, and banks can loan out more cash, making it rain. Raise it, and they have to hold on to more money, tightening things up. The Fed rarely uses this trick today, though. It's more of a last resort move. Next, we've got the discount rate, which is the interest the Fed charges banks when they need to borrow some dough. If the Fed lowers this rate, other interest rates drop, and suddenly, everyone's getting cheaper loans. It's like a store-wide discount sale on money, and banks are more willing to lend. Raise the rate, though, and borrowing gets pricier, slowing things down a bit. This is a tool the Fed still uses, but it's not the star of the show. The Fed's real go-to move is open market operations. This is when they buy or sell government bonds, like some kind of Wall Street day trader. If they buy bonds, money gets added to the economy as the bond seller puts their cash in the bank, and the cycle of lending kicks off again. If the Fed sells bonds, they're pulling money out of circulation faster than you can say budget deficit. This buying and selling also affects the federal funds rate. The interest rate banks charge each other for overnight loans, which can ripple out to affect the rates we all pay for things like mortgages and car loans. In short, the Fed has its hands on some pretty powerful levers when it comes to money, and they use them to make sure the economy doesn't get too hot or too cold. Kind of like an economic Goldilocks, trying to get it just right. Monetarism is the idea that the money supply is like the economy's thermostat. Get it right, and things run smoothly. Mess it up, and you're either freezing or sweating bullets. Essentially, monetarists believe the amount of money sloshing around in the economy is the biggest factor in how well or badly things are going. When the money supply is tight, interest rates shoot up, making borrowing expensive. But when the Fed opens the floodgates and money is everywhere, interest rates drop, and everyone's grabbing cheap loans like they're on sale. The Fed has two big moves: an easy money policy, where they pump up the money supply and lower interest rates, encouraging people to invest, spend, and generally make it rain. Then there's the tight money policy, where they do the opposite, shrinking the money supply and jacking up interest rates to cool things off. It's the economic equivalent of turning the AC on full blast. The catch? Timing is everything. If the Fed loosens things up too late, it's like throwing gas on a fire that was already burning fine, leading to inflation. And if they tighten things too soon, it's like slamming the brakes while you're still on the highway. Cue an economic pileup. There's also this thing called an inside lag, which is basically how long it takes the Fed to notice the economy's gone haywire and do something about it. By the time they figured it out, half the damage might already be done. Then there's the outside lag, which is the time it takes for whatever the Fed does to actually work. So even if they make the right call, it could kick in way too late, like trying to stop a runaway train with a feather. In the end, using monetary policy is like trying to steer a cruise ship with a toothpick. Sometimes the economy fixes itself before the Fed can even get its act together. But when things really hit the fan, they step in, hopefully with more than just a toothpick. Okay, and now it is time for our little recap. Fiscal policy is the government's attempt at managing the economy's rhythm by adjusting taxes and spending, all of which tie into the federal budget, a massive financial plan that requires multiple makeovers from the President and Congress. Keynesian economics suggests the government should spend more to stimulate growth, while supply-siders believe cutting taxes lets people fuel the economy themselves. Despite efforts to balance the budget, deficits are common, leading to borrowing and national debt. Meanwhile, the Fed uses monetary policy to control the money supply and interest rates. They have a few tricks, like adjusting reserve requirements, the discount rate, and open market operations. Timing is critical, as acting too late or too soon can wreak havoc on the economy, making the Fed's role both essential and tricky, like trying to steer a cruise ship with a toothpick. There you have it, folks. That is fiscal and monetary policy nutshelled. Thanks for stopping by Nutshelled History. Follow the policy of going nuts on the like and subscribe buttons for me. See y'all next time on Nutshelled History.